So welcome back to the New Zealand Property Podcast and Video Series, and kindly sponsored by Harcourt's Property Ventures at Alexandra Park, of course. And as you can see, we've got a very special guest next to me today, a man who makes policies like a think tank, so we'll talk about that later on, dances like John Travolta, and the New Zealand's next deputy.
You might get sued by John Travolta.
Yeah, I thought it was brave, but you know.
Yeah.
And obviously New Zealand's next Deputy Prime Minister, Act Leader, Honourable David Seymour. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, no worries. Thanks for having me on your show. And I gather this is New Zealand's first property podcast.
It is indeed, and you can't take that off me.
No,
take everything else off me, but not that. No, all good. Thanks for your time today. But I'll just start off. A third of New Zealanders are housed by property investors around New Zealand. Well, about that, I don't know the exact figure, but I know it's pretty close to that. People get confused or don't know, but people like property developers and renovators and developers, they all pay tax like other New Zealanders for what they do. And things like, I think people back a few years ago talked about capital gains tax and what have you, thought those people weren't. They were already taxed, those people. What it affects is tax for sort of mum and dad investors, I guess. And there has been rules in the last few years that have come in, and we'll talk briefly about that sort of thing soon. But what my major concern was mum and dad investors and the investors that house these third of New Zealanders, the last government have been hit them absolutely terribly, and it will cost over $10,000 extra a year to house these people that need houses. And in my opinion, this is why there's a lack of property for tenants over the last 2 or 3 years. I was quite angry over COVID, and I was going to do podcasts, but I was too angry. And so just congratulations to you and the coalition for immediately changing and reversing some of those rules that you said you would do, and people voted you because you said you would do that. So that's great, and they just didn't make sense, and it did make it worse for, I guess, tenants in New Zealand with rent rises that have gone up terribly in the last wee while.
Yeah, 100%. And look, there's a few things to say. First of all, I'm proud we promised, delivered, and basically, Labor wanted to go to 100% or 0% mortgage interest deductibility. The Nat wanted to kind of slowly go back by sort of 2027, and we said no, it's got to happen straight away. The compromise is we're 80% this year and 100% next year. So that's an area where I think we can proudly say that we've actually improved the policy beyond what anyone else would have done. But you just sort of backpedal a bit to what you're really saying, and it is a really strange paradox about the previous Labor government, that they came in promising inclusion and kindness, but in reality they were quite keen to pick off different groups. I remember I met a guy once, he was at a hunting show. I said, oh yeah, what do you do, where do you live? Oh, in a farm. I said, oh, what do you do for a job? He said, I work in oil and gas. And I thought, buddy, you've hit the trifecta. I mean, that's 3 different groups. People with firearms, people with farms, and the people in the oil and gas sector all got taken a go at. I think employers, a lot of the rules that were introduced kind of had the subtle subtext that employers were out to screw their workers, and therefore there needed to be more rules and more sick days and more holidays and higher minimum wages and harder to dismiss someone. So there were quite a few groups that sort of faced that. But the other one I thought really stood out was people who basically make the sacrifice to own a property other than the one they might live in, to then keep it up to standard, maintain it, enter into a contract, continue to do the servicing to keep it rentable, sometimes miss out on getting rent, sometimes have no revenue, eat the increases in interest rates that happen sometimes, and maybe make a buck out the other side. And these people, I think, are good people. They're actually doing something for other people and for themselves. That's positive. And the previous government really went after them too. So, Jacinda was all about inclusion and kindness, but man, she'd go after a minority group without hesitation. And so restoring some of the basic rights of being a landlord and a property owner has been important to this government. And the second thing, not to go on a bit, but I think another thing about the previous government is that they often didn't ask the most basic question in economics, which is what happens next. So, okay, you make it harder to be a landlord, you put up your taxes, you make it harder to evict bad tenants, you do a whole lot of stuff like that. you increase the standards required through healthy homes. What happens next? Well, inevitably, people either exit the market or raise their prices. So the tenants ended up with fewer options.
And those ones who are exiting the market make it even worse.
Yeah, exactly. And the worst of all, that the tenants who are the most vulnerable, you're unlikely to take. So it's just if you ask, first of all, do we want to go after minorities? No, but the previous government did. And do we want to apply good economic analysis just by asking what happens next? Well, if you crack down on one side of a symbiotic relationship, you hurt the other side.
Exactly, and that's one of the questions sort of I was going to ask later on was about the cause and effect, I guess, and you just sort of covered it, I guess, where they just didn't seem to understand what the ongoing effect was.
Cause and effect thinking, absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's one of the questions I was going to ask later. I'll ask you now. What do governments? I guess you can only talk with yourselves, but what are governments? How do they make? We're talking housing today, so the housing policies. What do they do? Who do they talk to see what goes on? To make the policy sort of thing.
Well, if you look at the basic cycle, so you've got a minister with an idea, you call in your officials and say, this is what I want to do, can you give me some advice? They write you a report and it has some options, a yes or no, or A, B or C. And then after a while you've kind of got to a stage where you've narrowed down what you want to do, you turn it into a cabinet paper, you take that to cabinet, and then the cabinet says yes or no. If the cabinet says yes, it's a government policy. Usually you talk to people first, so the cabinet almost always says yes, but occasionally it kicks back. And then sometimes one of the results of cabinet's agreement is that you then agree that all of us in the government are going to go to Parliament and support a law change. That's the basic cycle. Once the law's passed, then they're implemented, and then you go back to, well, what's the problem and do we need to change again? So you're going through that cycle constantly. In that cycle, you'll notice the only people that really get to give advice are your ministerial officials, so your Minister of Housing and Urban Development, for example, or your MB, and they can be varied. There are good people in the public service, but varied, and your ministerial colleagues. Now, that's why it's essential to have people like, say, Andrew King from the Property Investors Federation.
My first ever podcast, by the way.
Oh, was it really? Oh, well, there you go.
Ago.
Yeah, who can say, well, that's all fine, but here's a few realities. So the PIF, I think, have been really, really useful for that. And I also think that just getting out and listening to people. I mean, I try and visit businesses every week, just see what people are saying, because people in Wellington do not have a monopoly on wisdom, I can assure you.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things I'm most impressed about, and I'm not trying to agree is that you or act or anything up, but about 4 years ago I was running a group at Ponsonby for the Auckland Property Investor Association, and had a monthly meet-up, just investors, and it was right at the time when the government were going to stop offsetting the losses against property for property investors against their income. The only industry in the whole of the country where you couldn't actually offset any losses with your income. And had the meeting on the whatever night it was of the week, and Brooke Van Velden, you'll always see, turned up. It was the first and still the only politician I had in any of those meetings for the few years I was running them, and that was great. So she was there just to see how it affected the real people, and so that was probably got you a few votes actually that night, her coming along.
Yeah, well, Brooke had the housing portfolio in opposition, and she, Brooke's a real talent. I think the fact that she was able to win Tamaki from a standing start is extraordinary, but you get a lot of positive feedback about her from people who live over there. I think it shows that, in ACT, our view is that, whatever business you're in, you have to ask, what is our business? What do we do? And our business at core is representation. I mean, we take a whole lot of people's concerns and aspirations, try and synthesise that into that policy process I talked about, and try and align the direction of New Zealand with the hopes and dreams of the people who actually pay for it. It's actually a pretty simple business, really, and so I'm pleased to see it. At least one of my MPs took it to heart and showed up to hear some concerns and aspirations. So.
No, it did very, very much so. Just I know you're obviously not the housing minister, but you obviously have to have your finger in every pie there is. Obviously you've helped out investors early on in this tenure. What else do you have in store for sort of property investors or homeowners in the near future and where do you have them both sitting? I guess you've already explained sitting pretty high. But
Yeah, well, I mean, there's still changes going through in terms of Residential Tenancies Act, so bringing back 90 days, no fault eviction, getting rid of the automatic continuation of the tenancy. I forget what that's called, but it's bad. And also, I think it's 45 days or 21 days if you need to move into it yourself. So just restoring the basic idea that you actually own it, and you want to be a good landlord, want to have a good relationship with the tenant. It's important to them too, but you actually own it, so you do actually have the right to say, no, this is my property, you can't live here anymore, and you don't have to go into some Byzantine justification, because when you do, it's almost like you don't really own it, you're just sort of a partner in this relationship. And that's, of course, if you don't have clear property rights, then you're less likely to invest, you're less likely to want to get involved in the first place, and so there's actually less of the thing that you want. So you'll see those RTA changes, including pet bonds, and we think this is a good innovation in an unexpected way. So we said, well, there'd be landlords that would be keen to take on tenants with pets if they knew they could get some more security. So let's have pet bonds. But interestingly, the strongest supporters of this policy have actually been from pet refuge and women's refuge. Because unfortunately a lot of people who are abusive in their relationships actually use violence against pets to control their victim. I mean, it's all pretty horrible stuff, right? But it's a reality, and the people from the pet refuge, where they actually give the pet somewhere to go so mainly women, but domestic abuse victims can escape. They say, look, having more of a marketplace for rentals where you can take pets is important to them too. So that's actually not something we really planned, but just goes to show if you create markets and allow people to transact, then often they'll solve problems that maybe we didn't even think of.
Yeah, just on the RTA, actually, we had a question from, put it out to a few people. One question was I think in August last year, they were going to bring in the RTA, other Residential Property Management Tenancy Act, where you're making that a bit more official, like real estate agents are. And that's been put off. Why has that been put off? Can you sort of share, I guess, why?
Yeah, look, I have a mixed view on this. I mean, I'm generally not in favour of more hoops and more regulation, because it just means New Zealanders spend more time in compliance and administration and less time being productive. But I think it's fair to say we've also had quite a few complaints over the years of people who find that not everyone who says that they're a property manager can be relied upon to be a property manager. So, that's, I'm up in the air about that one. Obviously, as you say, I'm not the minister. Chris Bishop's responsible for that, and I think that reasonable people can go either way on it. I have a strong view.
Right. Okay. Right. Just in the last budget, there seem to be changes with social housing and the providers of the social housing. Can you sort of explain a bit about that and why they happened?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on there. First of all, the government has a huge number of housing grants. It's about $4 billion a year now that we're putting into housing, and that's one reason why we need the housing market to work better, because we as a government can't afford to put as much money as we do. And the money we spend on housing grants and subsidies, that comes away from health and education and roads and things that people really want to see.
I guess. Yep.
Exactly. So if the housing market worked better, we'd actually do a lot more other stuff that needs to get done. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, Kāinga Ora has, in our view, it's just been an unmitigated disaster. Because basically the Labour government had a belief that they could build houses better than the private sector, and it goes back to the mythology of the 1930s, Peter Fraser and Michael Joseph Savage, carrying the table through the first ever state home, and it's all a beautiful, story, but it's also 80 years old. And so our view is, look, what needs to happen is the government needs to create the circumstances where resource consenting, infrastructure funding and financing, building consenting, all of those things are as smooth as possible so that people can build more homes for themselves, rather than having KO as a home builder. Then you've got KO as a landlord. Again, they tried all these other objectives like sustaining tenancies, But what they didn't realise is that there's a whole lot of people that can't get a house, and those people are in the queue, while people who are in the house are misbehaving, terrorising their neighbours. And you just say, why do you keep sustaining tenancies and favouring those people when there's other, blameless people who just don't have anywhere? And of course, then you get the fact that there's an overall shortage because the building's been inefficient, the regulations are excessive, the infrastructure funding and financing is insufficient as well. And you've got all these people in motels, so the default has been, if in doubt, put someone in a motel. So we're clamping down on that. We're mindful that you still do need accommodation. So there's not going to be an end to people living in motels anytime soon as a result. But we've reduced the bias towards sending people there by default. We've got Kāinga Ora being refocused on managing the portfolio it has and actually being a purchaser of housing services from community housing providers rather than a sole provider and developer in its own right. And then you've got a whole lot of other reform going on, making it easier for everyone to build homes so that the supply issue will sort itself out. So there's going on now, there's a whole lot of stuff going on in housing. We're talking about three or four different fronts that we are making change, but I think on balance Chris Bishop's doing a pretty good job. So.
Yeah, just going on further from that, I guess, and it's a trouble that a lot of people I talk to and a lot of New Zealanders have issues with, and I'll say New Zealanders perhaps that live in some of the so-called better suburbs or whatever you like to call them. And obviously there are more people in the social housing being provided in some areas where once would have never probably looked at having social housing there. And this is sort of happening at the same time where New Zealanders are feeling very unsafe. We've had people are going to Australia in abundance, and I know, and I was selling people's houses. My daughter and son have both done the same thing, the last 2 years. And I guess what can you say to those people who are in those suburbs where social housing are going into those suburbs and people aren't feeling that safe? And what can people like ourselves as real estate agents even say, I guess, because right now it's very hard for a vendor selling a home at the moment. It's just going through the cycle. It's where we are in the cycle. So I say no dramas. It's a big drama for a lot of people there right now, but people won't buy if there's a social housing next door to it.
Yeah, well, it's a buyer's market, isn't it? I mean, I think part of the writing instructions that KO should have, and I believe they do have, but I'd have to check, is that look, they've got to optimise the number of homes that they build. So, if they've got property in a place like Remuera, where the land is extremely valuable, they've got a duty to ask themselves, would we be better off selling out of this and developing somewhere where we might be able to afford twice the area? Because if you've got a shortage of 25,000 people on a wait list, then you got to think about how you maximise. Don't build in expensive areas. But nonetheless, there are still areas where social housing is under the previous government's been developed. I mean, it's physically there. It's not going anywhere. All I'd say is that well managed, it can work, and we're certainly changing the rules to say that actually we're not going to have sustaining tenancies. We're not going to say that. No matter how badly you behave, we're the landlord of last resort, so you can stay here. We're actually starting to say, no, sorry, you get kicked out. And when you do that, first of all, it's fairer on other people on the waiting list. Second of all, it changes the whole dynamics. If you know the government might actually kick you out, then you're going to behave very differently.
I think so.
And the other thing I'd say for people and what you describe as nice as suburbs is that, generally speaking, if you get a state house in a good place, you got a really strong incentive to stay there. So I look at Banff Ave in Epsom. There was to say that there was concern about that being built back in 2018, I think it was, would be an understatement. There was certainly real concern about that development. But I think if you talk to most people on the street now, they'd probably say that it's worked out better than they anticipated. And I suspect the reason for that, it's quite a nice place as far as KO houses go, and it's also a very nice place to be. It's on the main bus route. It's next to Greenwood's Corner. It's a great area. So if you get one of those houses and you know that people will kick you out, the government will kick you out if you disturb the neighbourhood, then actually you've got every incentive to be a good neighbour. So those are some of the things that I think people should consider. But I don't deny there's been massive problems, and there continue to be. We're dealing with them in Parnell, all the time.
Yeah, yeah. With the your KO or housing homes, I guess the older homes I saw for a while, they were just putting in new homes, and that was about all they were doing. Are you looking at renovating some old homes to keep them in the pool of housing, or always just getting new homes only, or how's that sort of work? And a question I had from one of my listeners was, those old homes, would you sell them to first home buyers? In fact, what does happen to them? Does it just go on the market, or?
Well, I met with some KO local managers about 6 months ago, and they said, look, our objective is to sell out of high cost areas, so that we can develop more in lower cost areas. So that certainly was their objective last I met them, and I think it's the right thing to do.
Some of the previous problem.
Yeah, and the way I look at it is, look, there's a marketplace out there. There's a whole lot of landlords, there's community housing providers. The government's role should be to make sure that everyone has a roof over their head if they're really desperate. But that doesn't necessarily mean the government needs to own the houses itself. There's a lot of things that the government does where the assumption is that the government has to own it. But actually, if you think about it, overwhelmingly, healthcare comes from your local GP and your local nurse. The government doesn't own any of that. So, the GP network, some of the best health, I know that they're under pressure and there's all sorts of issues at the moment, but, putting aside, that's just a matter of numbers and ratios. The underlying model works extremely well. So if the government can do primary healthcare just by basically subsidising people who can't afford it with fees or capitation formula, then I don't think the government has to own all the houses to achieve the objective of making sure people have a home. I'll just tell you one thing that maybe is worthwhile. If you look at the fiscal track, the previous government spent a lot of money. In fact, about $100 billion of extra debt. We can't change that now. We're not going to go on about it. But if you look at where we're going now, we are saying $138 billion spending this year, $2.4 billion increase each year forecast into the future.
Right.
Now, $2.4 billion on 138 is about 1.7%.
Right.
Inflation, probably going to be about 2 in years to come. I hope it gets back to that. Population growth, net 50,000. That's 1%. So you got about 3% growth in population and inflation, but we're offering to increase government spending by 1.7. So already, we got to save $2 billion every year, just to stand still. So we are committed to relentless increases in efficiency in government, and that takes inflationary pressure out of the rest of the economy, and that means lower interest rates. So I think probably the number one thing that's on people's minds, when the hell do these interest rates fall?
Come down.
And I've got to say, I'm proud to be part of a government that is actually committed to tightening its own belt in acknowledgement of how everyone else has had to tighten their belts while the government run rampant over several years.
Yeah, and as said, back to the corporate parts of New Zealand to look after itself very well. The more property investors are looked after that house these people, the less pressure comes off the government to do that, and everyone's working together to get the same result for all those people in motels and God knows what sort of thing. So,
100%.
Yeah, it's a big vicious circle. I know there's just a couple of questions to finish, and I don't know if sort of a government's, there's something you said recently, but a government sort of more council type things. Just as the new minor dwelling rule, is it true that people are going to be able to do a minor dwelling without a code compliance? Or?
Yeah, so they call that the granny flat. You don't need a resource consent. But I think the main way to think about this, a lot of central Auckland, you're going to say, well, you don't really have room to do that anyway. I mean, most people that had a backyard have infilled it sometime between the 1960s and now. But if you think about a place where I grew up, rural Northland, a lot of people with a lot of space and a lot of people without much accommodation. Yep. And if it means that you can put a 60 square metre dwelling on a piece of property, and that's the difference between living in a shack or living in something a bit new and nice and warm and dry, then that's a tremendous step forward. And I think that we got a real opportunity to try to get we've got a real opportunity to solve a lot of this problem of people living in cars and garages and motels simply by saying, well, in a lot of parts of the country, the pathway to having a place to live in is going to be so much simpler than it has been to date.
I guess the follow-on question the investor had yesterday, because I think it's a great idea, but the follow-on question was really interesting. If we have a house, now, standard house on a section where the bathroom's it doesn't have a CCC, the bank won't borrow on it. The house it's not worthless, but it's worth a lot less if it doesn't have consent. Their question was, what so if we go to sell in 3 years' time and then the minor dwelling doesn't have a consent? Is that going to be worthless, or is that going to be because all the banks, I guess, borrow on it? So it was a pretty, I thought it was a
well, I mean, they're usually concerned
thought.
about, are you following the law? So long as this is the law, you're following the law.
Yep.
I guess it's possible a future government could decide they don't like this and ban the granny flat law. But you'd imagine that if they did that, they would grandfather in the ones that had been built under the law that existed. So I think don't take any legal advice from me, but if you just sort of step back and ask what the basic sort of common sense view is, probably that you're going to be fine, because the government and Parliament are saying that this is okay, and typically insurance companies will insure what the government says is legal.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and then it's still the government's trying to again get more people in housing. It's another way to do that, which is great. Just one last question. I had someone yesterday just ask me about the unitary plan. Obviously happened years ago. There was going to be changes. We heard a year or so ago about the single zoning going to 3 dwellings. Do you know when that's likely to happen?
Yeah, so look at the start of 2025, you'll see the law changes go through, and then the councils will have to act on that. So the law change will say, look, basically you've got to have 30 years supply, but you don't have to have MDRS, and if you do have any MDRS, you've got to re-vote on that at council. And I think what Aucklanders will find, at least, is that the Auckland Unitary Plan, if it doesn't give you 30 years supply already, it damn near will. So it'll be an effective reversal of most of the changes that we saw over the last 2 years. I mean, you've got to say, Labor and National cooking up that deal behind closed doors without consulting anyone. What were they thinking? But we campaigned against it for 18 months, and now that's going. So much like the mortgage interest deductibility, really proud to say that the Act has made a difference to more sensible policy. Because look, if solving the housing problem was as simple as just zoning everywhere to be intensified, I'd be all in favour of it. The reality is that you can zone the whole country as 3-story houses you want, but if you don't have the infrastructure, the materials, the builders, the consents to get to it, then you haven't solved any problem. And actually, I think we have enough zoned area that's theoretically developable. We've got to get into infrastructure funding and financing, building consents, doing the stuff that is actually required to fill in that theoretically zoned envelope, and that's where we now turn our attention to.
Okay, great. Well, we've had half an hour of your time already, which is probably more than we were meaning to have. So, I just again thank you for coming. Is there any final thoughts you want to? Usually I let someone talk about their business or whatever from there. You can finish it up if you want to.
Well, look, I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and grateful for people listening. All I'd say is we appreciate that people in Survive Till 25 mode. It's been a bloody dismal time, and all I would say is I think the changes that this government's making, and frankly the direction that ACT's bringing to this government, means that we are getting our own house in order to try and reduce the government slice of the pie, leaves more for others, and that will lead to a recovery over time. It'll allow less government spending, less inflation, lower interest rates, and also less regulation. And it's also about getting back to respecting the inherent dignity of each person. So, I talked at the start about all the groups, the fire owners, the farmers, the small business owners, the landlords. I mean, basically anyone trying to do anything got whacked under the culture of kindness and inclusion that Jacinda talked about, but was never hesitated to go after a minority group. We're really trying to build a New Zealand that incorporates everybody, that has a place for everybody, and that has a place for everybody to thrive and flourish in their own way. And if those are the basic values that you hold, then we share them. I think we can show and point to areas where we've actually put them in place in our time in government, and we'll continue to do so, but we appreciate your support.
Great stuff. Well, thank you very much again, David, for your time today. Thanks for listening and watching the listeners and watchers, and we look forward to seeing you again in another 2 weeks with another good New Zealander telling a good story. So thanks very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Cheers.